Hi, Ian. Welcome to the show. I'm very glad we can talk. Good
Richard,
afternoon.
it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we have today a great occasion to meet and to talk. There is actually two things, very important things that happened this week, and kind of in U.S.-China relationships. One is the release of your book, and the other one is, I guess, Top Gun, right? I don't know how you got this right, because both important things released in the same week, right?
Well, that's very kind of you to say, but there's no way my book could ever come close to the
Uh,
importance
I, I
of
think I think
God.
that it's not a coincidence. Okay, but so I want to say my first impression was really good. I liked it, and then I can tell you definitely have a talent for writing because some of those uh, passages or chapters really read like a spy novel. It's really a pleasure to read, and it's almost like a novel at moments. And there is a lot of interesting parts that I didn't really know. And the first one I would like to start with is actually the bio and the life of Xi Jinping, which I was, like many people, I know it, but I was really, the way you presented it and showed his life is actually, it's actually almost sad. I felt bad for him. And I thought maybe you could talk about this, like the way you presented all his suffering, what he went through, and later in life with his marriages. That must have been really tough on him.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. At its heart, this book is really trying to tell the story of China's government's vision for the future and what that vision means for all the rest of us. And of course, that's a hard analytic problem to have, but it's an interesting one and it's a
Yes.
challenging one. And so, in the course of research, to try to get at this issue of how does the regime in Beijing, how do they see the world? What is their worldview? How do they perceive the world as it is, and how would they like the world to become in the future? And so I had the great good fortune of reading a number of Xi Jinping's biographies, both in English and in Chinese. And that for me was one of the most fascinating pieces of the whole project was to look at the way Xi Jinping um, had what his lived experiences have been. So Xi Jinping as the ruler, to try to understand what is Xi Jinping thought, what the Chinese Communist
Yes.
Party refers to as Xi Jinping thought, but also who is Xi Jinping the man? Because there's so little we actually know
Yes.
about his life and the lives of his best friends and his family and his colleagues on the Politburo. There's so little we actually know about the men who rule China today. And so in the book, in chapter 3 of the book, I spend a few pages going through his life. And one of the things that surprised me the most in doing the research was to see just how brutalized Xi Jinping was
Yes.
by the regime at a very young age and how traumatic his life story actually is. I mean, here's a guy who was raised by killers. I mean, Xi Jinping's dad went to jail when he was still in high school. When Xi Jinping's dad was in high school, when he was a teenager for attempted murder, he was a fighter in the Chinese Revolution. So was Xi Jinping's mom. They were both revolutionaries. They were in combat. And then, of course, they were officials in the early days of the People's Republic of China. So here's a guy who's raised by essentially killers, right? Whose eldest sister, his eldest half sister from his dad's previous marriage,
Yes.
herself was murdered when Xi Jinping was still a teenager. She was murdered in the chaos and the terror of the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping's mom was forced to disown him publicly when he was 15 years old. Um, Xi Jinping's first wife left him after 3 years of marriage. He had terrible professional problems right out of college. Um, he's a guy who's really been through a lot. And now I think we're seeing him, and of course, this is a little bit of pop psychology. Nobody can say for sure. But now we're seeing some of his own policy behavior, which from the outside appears fanatical. It appears um, really very
Yes.
irrational, and certainly very dark. I mean, we're watching him as the ruler of China engage in genocide in Xinjiang. We're watching some of the worst human rights atrocities in modern times occur, and not just in Xinjiang, but also in Tibet, in the Hui Muslim region, in Ningxia province, and many other places. We're watching him suppress human rights and freedom of speech in Hong Kong. And I argue in the book that if we want to understand why he's doing this, it might be helpful to understand his own lived experiences.
Yes.
And so the idea is not to feel sorry for the man, even though he has had a very, very hard and bitter life in many respects. The idea is not to feel sorry for him or to make excuses for him because his behavior is inexcusable. It's absolutely atrocious. He is a monster. I mean, there's no question about that. But for us to empathize, it doesn't mean that we agree, but to empathize, to try to put ourselves in his shoes to understand what he's been through and what it must be like to have grown up in that system and now to rule that system.
Yeah, but even as an older, mature man, you even write about his marriage and divorce, that he was kind of, he had to go through, pain again because his first wife left him and maybe he wasn't a good match. It sounds a little bit like that, right?
It does sound that way. And of course, we don't know. We don't
Yes,
know the personal details like that. Um, you know, unlike in many other countries, certainly
yes,
unlike in the United
yes,
States,
yes,
there's no such thing as really good gossipy, scandalous investigative reporting that
yes.
comes out of China. We simply don't know what goes on behind closed doors in China. All we can do is take the little pieces of information we have and to try to piece them into a picture, which in
But
some
from what I
cases,
know, I think she still lives in the UK, right? She lives in London. She stayed there,
um,
right?
I've read different accounts. So
Yeah.
yeah, Xi Jinping's first wife
Yes.
did leave him after 3 years of marriage. She moved to London, where her dad was the PRC ambassador to the UK. Uh, Different accounts say different things. So by some accounts, she stayed there and she was very successful. Other accounts say that maybe she moved to Hong Kong. And so, like so many of these officials, in many cases, we don't know where they are today and what they're doing.
But you say we don't have accounts, but there are people who met him. Like, there's reports from different, three-letter agencies or maybe, business people who met him, politicians, ambassadors. Did you maybe, did you read something about him, like some reports, evaluations, how he is personally? Because what I read is that he's a confident guy, easygoing in personal contact, that he knows what he's talking about, kind of a bit different than in the public view.
Yeah, so there was some really good investigative
Yes.
reports that came out, especially when he first rose to power, when he became the paramount leader in 2012 and in early 2013, when he really consolidated power.
Yes.
There were some great reports that were done where they did look into some of these leaked memos that came out, I believe, of the State
Yes. Yeah,
Department,
yeah, yeah.
WikiLeaks,
Yeah, yeah,
perhaps.
yeah. Exactly. Yes.
And journalists also interviewed people in China that had met him or worked with
Yes.
him or interviewed him. Evan Osnos did a fantastic biographical sketch of Xi
Yes, I
Jinping.
know.
And the story that comes out of that is exactly what you're describing, Richard. It's somebody who is very affable,
Yes.
very friendly, very easygoing. In many ways, somebody who's very down to earth, somebody who does not appear to be greedy, either for money or for
Yeah,
power.
like honest, really hating corruption. And in one of the CIA reports, I think I read that he comes off as boring towards women because he's so committed to his cause and so much involved in politics that he's almost unable to talk about anything else. So somebody even wrote that he might be like that, perceived by women. So he really seems to be committed to his cause, and it seems like he's always hated corruption. So it may be a very genuine feeling deep inside.
Well, it's interesting how that is his image as Mr. Clean, because actually, according to the best accounts we have, he himself is corrupt. I mean, he used bribery to join the Chinese Communist Party. So he
Oh
was
yeah, yeah,
rejected
that's right.
by the party
Yes,
by some accounts over 10 times. So he
yes,
applied for membership
yes,
in the CCP. He was rejected repeatedly. And then finally, he had to resort to corrupting the local official. He used a food bribe because at that time, of course, in the early mid 1970s, everybody was starving. And he used that to actually join the Chinese Communist Party and to escape from what at that time was an open air prison that he lived in. Um, we have seen him in power use this remarkable anti-corruption campaign to consolidate power. He has not gone after his own friends and
yes,
his own political acolytes, which suggests that it's not an actual genuine anti-corruption
yes,
campaign, that he's using it in some cases to go after real corruption, but in many other cases to consolidate his own power. Because of course we all know that the three secrets to fighting corruption, the time proven methods for fighting corruption, uh, all involve investigative journalism,
yeah.
right?
Transparency, yes,
Independent media, independent judiciary, independent
yes,
police, and judges and lawyers, and they all involve having alternative political parties,
yes,
whether it's in your parliament or in your Congress, who are only too happy to shine a bright spotlight on you when you slip up. And then they can make political hay out of it, right? And of course, we've seen none of those things in China. In fact, Xi Jinping's been very, very regressive in all of those areas. I mean, he is truly a dictator in a one party dictatorship today. And so that would suggest that he's not genuinely interested in fighting corruption because he's not done any of the things that you would
yes.
need to do at a structural level to actually fight corruption. But it is at the same time very interesting how he's been able to build this reputation as kind of a crime fighter, right? And a lot of people buy into that, which is quite remarkable.
Okay, if we move a little bit closer to today, so what do you think, how shielded and lonely is he at the top? Because it turns out now, Putin was maybe lied to, and all the corruption around him. And so how do you think is it with him when he makes his decisions? Did he really know about the situation of the Russian army, or did he double check? And then, like, even here at this example, we see that his information doesn't seem to be correct. If he knew the truth, he might not have agreed to Putin's aggression. So, what do you think? How how is the information flow? Does he really know what's going on, or maybe he doesn't?
We can only speculate because we don't have good insights into what goes on in the halls of power in Beijing. But we do know that in any totalitarian system, in any dictatorship, you are always going to create this this environment where everybody is afraid of the boss, right? In
Yes,
any regime that is built on terror and that uses terror to sustain itself, or terror tactics, you are going to create an environment where Xi Jinping is not going to get honest opinions from his generals, for example, or from his political advisors, or the top intelligence officers. And so, even though the intelligence services, both the domestic services and their external services, are by many accounts phenomenal, and it's really incredible what Chinese intelligence has been able to achieve. It doesn't necessarily mean that Xi Jinping himself is getting the very best intelligence. In fact, he may be getting very bad intelligence because nobody wants to tell him anything that they don't believe that he wants to hear.
because apparently Putin believed that Ukrainians would welcome his army. So I wonder, does maybe he believe that Taiwanese would welcome his people? I mean, he might really believe it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's entirely possible that he does believe that. It's entirely possible that he buys into his own narrative. I mean, Richard, you were talking about how ideological he is and how boring he is in many respects. He
Yes.
comes across as somebody who's he has deeply held political beliefs. And if you read into what is Xi Jinping thought, if you read into the textbooks
Yes.
now that they're forcing elementary school students and high school students
Yes.
and university students and graduate students to study, they're very boring in many respects, and they're full of jargon. And once you peel back what a lot of that jargon actually means, what those euphemisms mean, a lot of it is irrational. A lot of it is irrational. It's not based on science or fact. A lot of it's based on mythical thinking.
Okay, the last question regarding his life is I wanted to ask one thing. To me, it seemed like he maybe overdid it. It seems to me like the CCP was on its way to really achieve what they wanted, but I think he hurried a little bit too much. He didn't really stay, under the radar like his predecessors. Maybe it's his ego, maybe, yeah, his tough life. But it seems to me if he kept a bit more, under the radar, he might have pulled it off. But then Trump came and then they really said, okay, we call your bluff, that's enough. And yeah, and they started fighting back. So it seems to me if he kept the pace that was there before, he might have achieved his goals.
Well, unfortunately, he still might achieve his goals.
Yeah.
It's far too early to say. I certainly agree with your point that he's much more transparent in many respects about his ambition. He puts his ego on proud display for the world to see. I mean, he really has created this cult of personality around himself since he's become the paramount leader in China. I mean, forcing elementary school students to read your books, for example, is not normal behavior for any
Yes.
politician, any
Yes.
national leader. Um, but it really is unclear whether or not he will fail. It's still quite
Yeah, we will
possible.
know soon. In a few months, we should know more or less.
Well, even then, we still won't know if he's been successful at achieving his broader aims because the world is not going to stop turning at the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes.
Um, what Xi Jinping talks about, and in fact, what the Chinese Communist Party as a political organization collectively talks about, is a much broader campaign to change the world. And that did not start with Xi Jinping, and it's not going to end with Xi Jinping either.